like to introduce our for our Fireside chat, Patrick Sullivan. Y'all may know him, and Tony Jamous with Nexmo. So thanks a lot, guys, and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Ron. Alrighty, so if you have not met Tony, he is a fabulous person. He is the president of Nexmo, and if you have not heard of Nexmo, you really should have. They have been doing some very cool things for the last 6 years, and in fact, they've been on the news recently because they got acquired by Vonage. If you don't know who Vonage is, I'm not sure if you actually should be in telecom because they're a pretty big company. So, Tony, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Patrick.
We'll just go over a couple quick questions, and then if any of the crowd wants to ask any questions. But first of all, why don't you tell us about Nexmo and what you guys are doing, and then just kind of CPaaS in general, just in case anybody out there doesn't know what CPaaS is.
Sure. So let's start with CPaaS. So CPaaS is a new industry segment that was defined by the analysts. It means a platform for communication. So we are a CPaaS. So what we do is we provide APIs and SDKs for developers in messaging, voice, authentication, and we really focus on 3-4 customer segments. So we're not enabling service providers, but we're enabling enterprises to build the communication stacks to empower their business. So communication as a core would be one of the customer segments. WhatsApp, Line, WeChat would be a good example of that. Communication as a feature, another customer segment. So all the travel, e-commerce, transportation would be a good example of that. And the third one that it's growing these days after CPaaS become much more established is legacy augmentation. So if you have an existing contact center, you've paid millions of dollars to build out, you don't want to remove that altogether, you can augment the capabilities through APIs. So we are a 5-year-old company, $100 million run rate, now part of Vonage. We got acquired in June this year. And we're also a global company. So US is a small part of our business. Asia actually is our biggest region, and Europe as well.
Fantastic. Now, a lot of people have heard of a company called Twilio. They're a little tiny company right down the street from here. How would you say you guys differentiate yourselves from the Twilios of the world or the Plevos of the world?
Sure. So we are a direct competitor to these guys. They are also considered by the analysts as CPaaSs. And where we really differentiate is we believe that the programmability or the ease of programmability is table stakes. You know, everybody should have a great developer experience. We really focus on making sure as after you deploy, it can scale and can work. So we spend 5.5 years building a great direct-to-carrier network with algorithms to make sure that you can scale without worrying about the changing regulation or some bottlenecks that happens along the line of communication. Got it.
So now I'm going to ask you some tough questions, and I blame my marketing team for putting me up here because I always ask the random ones. So Vonage acquired you guys for $250 million, and that's fantastic. In 5 years, you guys grew from 0 to $250 million of value, so that's amazing. Congratulations. Recently, Twilio went public, and from a revenue standpoint, I believe Twilio's kind of considered the top in revenue, and then you guys were, close in second.
Yeah, like twice as big from a revenue standpoint.
Correct. So Twilio now is valued at $4.5 billion, and you guys were sold for $250 million. Was it a good decision to sell? Was it a better decision to wait this out and see how Twilio IPO'd, and then if you should have IPO'd? Or, what's your thought process? And I know hindsight's always 50-50 or 20-20 or whatever the number is, but it's $4.5 billion to $250 million. So what's your thoughts with that?
Sure. So I believe it's the right decision because we were much smaller than Twilio. We raised 10 times less capital. We've been around half of their time. We were not ready to go public in the time frame that the market have set to us. These are external factors that you need to deal with. So we started getting some inbound interest to get acquired. So we started entertaining this inbound interest. And we believe that actually if we don't do that, we will end up having bigger competitors down the line that has bigger balance sheets and they can actually outspend us and outgrow us. So it was the right decision to join forces with $1.5 billion company to accelerate our track and continue delivering on our vision going forward.
Okay, that makes sense. So,
and also, just to mention as well, it's also about, if you want to compare from an entrepreneurship standpoint, is what is your return on the exit, right? So when you raise $250 million, well, you have diluted most of your shares, right? So at the end of the day is who makes the biggest exit from a return on investment point of view and time to market as well.
Absolutely. And that kind of is a follow-up question too, is where is the market going? I mean, you mentioned that, a lot of people are getting in the CPaaS market. Where do you actually see this going? And then yesterday, Omar, who's the Chief Product Officer of Vonage, he mentioned that today's products are tomorrow's features. Do you see CPaaS eventually becoming just a feature, or is it going to be an industry for a long time?
Yeah, I think this year is a year where CPaaS has become very well known by the investor community, thanks to Twilio, and by the industry analysts as well. And we start seeing some increasing adoption from enterprises of CPaaS. If you look at 5 years ago, most of the customers that were using APIs for communication were digital native companies, no stack companies that didn't want to reinvent communication stack, but rely on increasingly mature backends like Twilio and Nexmo. But we're seeing a shift into traditional enterprises that want to become more agile, want to use APIs to accelerate their innovation, and fight these same digital native that are disrupting their business. Netflix disrupting the media business. You have Uber disrupting, classic example, the transportation industry, and so on. So we see these agile enterprise customer segment growing much faster going forward. And to give you an example, a few weeks ago we met one of the largest banks in the world. They have 40,000 in-house developers. And they told us that we know that this year we're going to buy Cisco again, but we know we have 10% customization and stitching to do, and we need APIs to do so. But we also know that in the future that 10% will be 20% and 30%. So we see increasing adoption and realization from these enterprises that if they buy SaaS products in certain area of their business, it's just a matter of 1 or 2 years that SaaS becomes obsolete and they get stuck again.
Absolutely. And feel free next time you're talking to those banks to mention Kazoo. It's another product that's an alternative to Cisco. Just mentioning that. So going along with that, you mentioned Uber. And I think you guys actually have a relationship with Uber. And I think you guys have a relationship with Facebook Messenger and some of the other big ones. When I was looking at Twilio's kind of IPO, statistics, they pretty much, majority of the revenue is coming from 5 customers. Do you guys have a game plan on how to attack those 5 customers, or are you looking more just for general developers and you don't really care particularly about those 5 particular customers?
Yeah, so these 5 top customers are also somehow our customers too, because when some of these customers become large and they're spending millions of dollars, for them, whether it takes 5 minutes to integrate through the API or 2 hours, it's not going to matter anymore. So they look at post-production performance, they look at scalability, they look at cost efficiencies, so they start introducing multiple vendors. So essentially, the top 10 customers of CPaaS in the world have multiple vendors, and most probably have both Twilio and Nexmo in there. So our focus is really continue to building the developer community, building a developer experience that actually is great to make it easier and faster for them to build, but at the same time, building a much more robust scalability engine behind the scenes so that as these customers continue to grow, they continue to give us part or all of their business.
Absolutely. Would you give any recommendations on, you mentioned building a developer community. That's something that we try to focus on. And I would say our documentation might not be the best documentation, but besides documentation, is there any recommendations you'd say when building a developer community, how to build a developer community?
Yeah, I think we look at a number of, I would say, mix that we use. Of course, events, online communities, content, developer content is really important. And and most recently, we start looking at, okay, how can we change our whole marketing approach into the market? And the problem of being a CPaaS or any platform is that it's a very abstract concept. Like, people don't know what they can do with a platform necessarily until they know exactly what they want to do. So we start building what we call the use case engine, and we're building over 100 use cases that you can build over a CPaaS. And we include programmable objects and tutorials in there, so that not only the product managers know what they can do, what the benefit, what the business impact would be, but they could share that with their developer, and developers say, yes, this is going to take me 5 minutes to implement. So we're connecting the business value with the developer experience, and I believe it's this process will be improved and evolve. But I think this is how complicated platforms like this can be marketed effectively.
Absolutely, and that's actually great advice. So earlier, you and I were chatting outside about the integration with Vonage now, and now that you guys were primarily known as a messaging company, now you're offering voice through Vonage. Would you say, well, obviously it's an exciting thing, so congratulations. And we were kind of joking about it, which is now you guys are being run as kind of a separate entity from Vonage, but you're integrating into their network. How is that integration going, and are you guys ready to start offering voice traffic, or is that still a product that's just getting up and running?
Yeah, so we've launched our first generation of voice API based on voice XML 2 years ago, and we didn't have any voice expertise in the company. Actually, we've met at that time, and we've generated millions of dollars just on simple TTS business. But then with the acquisition of Vonage, we've actually relaunched a new API in September based on JSON with higher programmability and more functionalities. But since the acquisition, the first thing we've done is to use the Vonage network. And the Vonage network is 15 billion minutes of calls, direct peering agreements in the US. So in the past, customers needed to make a trade-off. Should I go with easy-to-use programmable API that doesn't have the backbone and the carrier-grade network, or should I go with a level 3? So today, they don't need to make that trade-off anymore. We provide the easy-to-use programmability and scalability, and also the network behind the scenes.
That's great. And where do you see, I mean, from a CPaaS in general, do you still see most people using it for messaging, or do you see it's kind of a split 50-50 with voice and messaging? Yeah,
so messaging is around 55% of the market, and voice is the remaining of the market, and we see them growing, both of them at the same rate. We work with a lot of analysts, and we expect 60% CAGR till 2020 for both of these channels. But it depends on the customer segment. Like, for instance, in contact centers, contact center augmentation, we see more shift to messaging, specifically when it comes to chat app or in-app messaging, to complement the voice experience and to improve it.
Speaking of which, what's your viewpoint on things like RTC and WebRTC and kind of the direction of that when it comes to CPaaS?
Yeah, so most calls in the future will be IP-based. That's the phone number will remain as an identity, but the underlying network, even when you think about IMS, is going to VoLTE is IP-based essentially, and we believe RTC is playing and is going to continue to play an important role in the future. From a technology standpoint, when you look at the target market of CPaaS, we're talking enterprises that don't have developers that are like we are here, experts in telcos. And they don't want to kind of continue to change their stack as the technology matures. So what we focus on is really creating an abstraction layer for them, so that they have the peace of mind that they can use the stack for as long period of time, instead of keep looking at what's going on the back end on the RTC stack. So really focus on the business benefit and the abstraction layer for these enterprises so that they can scale.
Absolutely. About 2 weeks ago, Dreamforce was here, and if anybody who lives in San Francisco, it's an awful experience because they destroy our roads. But while Dreamforce was here, I walked by and saw a lot of companies that were building off Nexmo and Twilio, and they're kind of clouding themselves as kind of like the next generation of telecom. Where do you see the industry is going as far as web-based systems versus web-based and traditional landlines? Do you see it slowly going to web-based, or do you think the traditional landlines will still be around for a bit?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a hybrid mode for a period of time. you think about the Prius model, Toyota Prius. I think this is what the world is going to be for the next 10 years until we become fully IP-based. And really, I think the value is going to be more on the higher level. Like, what can you do with this technology? What's going to enable you to improve your business, make a better user experience? And everybody hates to use these conferencing bridges and call support on a landline. So there's going to be, but sometimes you're going to need to do that. And the technology behind the scene might still be PSTN, but the experience could be much more contextual and much more improved for the user.
Great. And finally, from an international standpoint, where are you guys expanding to? Where are you looking to? Because I remember I read somewhere that you guys are connected to 650 carriers out there. That seems like a lot of carriers. Is that kind of your ultimate goal, is to be, the one point of contact for the world, or like what's your long-term vision with that?
Yeah, so we needed to do the heavy lifting behind the scenes on the messaging side, because it's an industry that's much less mature than voice. There's around over 1,000 carriers, so we still have a roadmap to go to, and that results in better efficiency, better performance. But from a pure customer location point of view, today we're present in Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, in Europe, and in the US. And we see growth, of course, in the US, but we see much higher growth in Asia, where both the digital native companies, every day you have, a unicorn being created in China, for instance. So we see a lot of these innovation being executed in Asia, but also driven by or influenced by what's going on in the US. So our plan is really to go one level deeper into geographical expansion from a physical location point of view.
Got it. So if I'm an investor, I should contact you and find out where in the world the most messages are coming from which company, and then talk to them about investing in those guys?
Yeah, we can. We have some of that insight. Of course, we don't share much of that, but we look at the trends. But what's interesting fact is I run a correlation analysis between technology exports and where our revenue is located, and it's a correlated curve. So essentially, the more you see countries that are exporting technology and have more developers, the more we see revenue, which help us to have a more analytical, data-driven expansion roadmap.
I can absolutely see that. That's impressive. Well, that's pretty much most of my questions. Is anybody in the audience? You have the president of Nexmo, which again, in 5 years, sold for $250 million, which is a ton of money. Is there any questions in the audience? Alrighty, and finally, Tony, let me ask you one last question if there's no questions in the audience. If anybody wants to try your services, what's the best way to get started?
Just go online on Nexmo.com and get an API key and start building your app. I built, because I hate conferencing bridges, so I built my own conferencing with no pin code, just dial in and you're into the conference, and basically one JSON line of code.
Very cool. All right, guys. Well, this is Tony from Nexmo, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. All right, now, next, as we know, today we're talking about the future, and Darren had alluded to the fact that mobile is being rolled out again, thankfully.